local government will answer questions on her behalf.
Questions without notice. Are there any questions? And I give the call to the honourable member for Menzies.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Brendan's Quality Meats in my electorate has been serving our community for 42 years. Owner Brendan says he has seen the impact of rising cost of living in his customers, saying people have been increasingly switching to cheaper meats. Will this out-of-touch Prime Minister finally admit that Australian families always pay more under Labor?
Order. Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, and I thank the member for Menzies for his question. And certainly I say to him that he can inform Brendan that certainly all of us in this chamber should be aware of the pressures that are on over cost of living. Cost of living is a direct result of the inflationary impact that, of course, in the beginning of March 2022 quarter, before this government was elected, is the highest jump in inflation that we have seen this century, of 2.1%. So I'm sure that Brendan is conscious of that, and I'm sure that the member for Menzies would inform Brendan of that accurately. We have taken action, and we know that there's more to do. One of the things that we've done to take action, of course, is pharmaceuticals, where we've cut the price of PBS medicines from $42.50 down to $30.
The member for Casey.
The first cut in the cost of pharmaceuticals under the PBS in 75 years, since the former Labor government created that. Of course, we know that when those opposite had the opportunity under the Leader of the Opposition as the Health Minister, his idea was to put a tax on people visiting the GP of $7. His other big idea was to increase the cost of prescriptions by $5. But the other idea that he had about cost of living was to remove the restrictions on state and territory governments that prevent hospital emergency departments charging a fee for presentation.
Order. The Prime Minister will just pause, and I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Well, Mr Speaker, on relevance, on the 8th of February, you directed the Prime Minister back to the terms of the question after he spent more than a minute attacking the opposition and not directly engaging with the terms of the question. He's doing the same thing, and I call upon you to rule as you previously did.
I'll hear from the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, I think from recollection that ruling on the 8th of February was dealing with a question that didn't have a tag nearly as broad as the one that was just asked.
The question was about cost of living, in particular with order. The member for Hume, regarding the cost of living prices rising and a political tag at the end of the question about the Prime Minister's commitments, and I'm going to give him the call, and if he is not being relevant, he'll be drawn back to the question.
Thanks
and listen carefully to his answer.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I was talking about the cost of living. And imagine the cost of living increases if the former Health Minister, the now Leader of the Opposition, had have got his way and removed the restrictions on state and territory governments in having hospital emergency departments paying a fee to visit. Now, the Deputy Leader says, "Is that all you've got?"
Order.
They show contempt
on my left
for the issues of the costs of health care and how important they are to cost of living.
The Minister for Home Affairs.
The same people who opposed and still oppose the $1.5 billion we have for energy price relief to take pressure off the cost of living, come in here and just show how out of touch they are, how they're against absolutely any initiative that is put forward.
Time has concluded. Order. We'll hear from the member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How will the passage of the safeguard mechanism help Australia achieve our climate change targets, provide business with certainty and build a better future?
And I give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Higgins for her question and for her advocacy. One of the reasons why the member for Higgins is sitting in this chamber as the best ever member for Higgins is because she understood, like a majority of her constituents who sent her here, that climate change was an issue that had to be dealt with, that it had to be dealt with in a practical way that made a difference. And that's why, after a wasted decade, today is indeed a good day. It's a good day for our environment, but a good day for our economy as well. A win for every Australian who voted for real action on climate change. The fact is that we received an endorsement at the election to move to enshrine 43% by 2030 and net zero by 2050, and to put Australia on a realistic path to get there. But these numbers are only the what. The how is the safeguard mechanism. We recognise that business needs certainty and stability, which is why the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Australian Industry Group, the Business Council of Australia, the Minerals Council of Australia, individual businesses in this country were crying out for this legislation to be carried. Order. And I want to congratulate and thank the Minister for Energy, but I also want to thank every member of the crossbench, including the Greens political party, for being prepared to come up with a real practical solution, for not allowing the perfect to be the enemy of the good in their own views, which they have. The fact is that we want to move Australia forward. Those opposite cannot move past their pathology of political conflict. But this legislation is Australia's chance to move past them, to move past the decade of denial that we saw from those opposite, with 22 energy policies announced and none of them delivered. We now have the opportunity to put that wasted decade behind us, with greater investment in the cheapest form of new energy, that is renewables. What we can be is a renewable energy superpower. We can take advantage of the fact that we live in the region with the fastest growth in human history. This is good for jobs, good for our economy and also good for our environment.
Give a call to the honourable member for Flinders.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Hugh Saunders, a resident of Brighton East in the electorate of Goldstein, was told in January that his energy bill would rise by over $1,700 this year. The member for Goldstein voted for the government's so-called price cap legislation. Will this out-of-touch Prime Minister finally admit that Australian families always pay more under Labor?
I give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Flinders for pointing out the fact that indeed the member for Goldstein is a part of the solution, not a part of the problem, and that she did vote for the legislation that was before this parliament, because Australians have been crying out for action on climate change. One of the reasons why the member for Goldstein is here, one of the reasons why she is here is because of her position, which she went to the election on, supporting action on climate change, like the other crossbenchers up there. And for those opposite, even after Saturday, to not have some sort of bell ringing, some sort of wake-up call after the Victorian state election, where Daniel Andrews increased his majority, I'm not quite sure what it takes for them to realise that the future and people want action for the future. Now, those opposite can be stuck in the past, but we will continue to move forward. Along with, as part of global action, as part of international action that we need to be a part of. Those opposite are just so stuck in the past. And the problem isn't that they're frozen in time while the world warms around them. The problem is they want everyone to stay back there and keep them company. Well, those on this side of the House will not do that. We will continue to engage in a constructive way, to get things done in this parliament. And what amazes me is that those opposite actually have an opportunity to participate in debate, but instead they choose to be observers. They don't participate at all in any of the processes that are there before the Senate or any of the processes here. They just come in here and vote no, 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 no to everything, which is why they get so upset when I say they're the no-alition. Well, if they're upset by that, they should stop acting like it.
The Prime Minister will refer to the opposition as the coalition. I give the call to the member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. How is the Albanese Labor government strengthening the safeguard mechanism, and what will be the environmental and economic outcomes of these reforms?
The member for Barker will cease interjecting, particularly when ministers are being asked questions and before ministers even begin speaking. If he does that anymore, he will not be here in question time. I give the call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question. I know how important she feels today's vote of the House of Representatives to pass the safeguard reforms is. I know all her colleagues agree with her, because today the House of Representatives sent a message to investors right around Australia, to industry right around Australia and to investors right around the world.
Order.
The climate wars are in retreat, Mr Speaker. Not every member of this House gets it, that is true, but the parliament as a whole and the bulk of the parliament understands it in this House, and I'm very confident in the other House as well. This is important because after 10 years of denial and delay, the time for action is, of course, now. Now, the honourable member asked me what the environmental and economic implications of the passage of the bill will be. Well, the environmental implications are very clear. We would not have achieved our targets without passing this bill and without implementing this reform. That is very clear. Now, that is unimportant to some in the House. Some in the House would be just fine with Australia not achieving its 43% emissions reduction target. Some in the House have and continue to oppose the 43% emissions reduction target, but this government is committed to the 43% emissions reduction target, and we are delivering it. And we're delivering it importantly today. These 205 million tonnes of emissions that will be removed as a result of these reforms are absolutely vital, equivalent to 2/3 of the cars on Australia's roads. That is what is at stake, and that is why it's important that the House does what it did today and that the Senate will do in a few days' time. It's also important economically, Mr Speaker, because we've sent the message to the world. The days of 22 energy policies are over. The days of changing and switching between policies are over. Under this government, this country has one energy policy and we're getting on and delivering it, Mr Speaker. One energy policy that will be delivered. The Albanese government gets things done. I know this is an unusual concept to those opposite. They're outraged that a government would actually deliver a policy, but we actually get things done, Mr Speaker. We work with the business community and we welcome the response to the Business Council and peak groups today in response to this government's ability to get its agenda through, again something which has not been seen for the last decade. Mr Speaker, it's important as the world decarbonises that Australia gets its share of the economic action. It was not happening before May last year. Business as usual would see emissions go up and economic opportunities lost. Well, business as usual is not acceptable to this government. We will work with the business community to see emissions down and jobs up, and that's exactly what we are doing.
I give the call to the honourable member for Wentworth.
My question is to the Prime Minister. In 2014, you told this House that independent cost-benefit analysis of infrastructure proposals was necessary to, and I quote, ensure that there is proper value for taxpayers from infrastructure investment and that we get the right infrastructure investment to boost productivity. Does the Prime Minister still hold this view, and if not, why not?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much. I thank the member for Wentworth for her question. And indeed, I'm very proud that we established Infrastructure Australia. Was one of the first pieces of legislation in the first week of the new Labor government when Parliament first sat in 2008 after the 2007 election. What that did was bring together a board, a serious board made up of private sector representatives as well as representatives from state and local government to make sure that there was productivity analysis so that the funding and investment from the Commonwealth went to the right projects. That was a board that contained people such as Sir Rod Eddington, Mark Birrell, the former Kennett government minister in Victoria, was the deputy chair. We had people like Kerry Schott and Heather Ridout, serious people doing proper analysis through the process. And what that led to was projects being funded, every single one of the priority projects being funded. Upon coming to office, we now have legislation before this parliament to amend Infrastructure Australia to make sure it goes back to where it should be. And indeed, the former board, I mean, with respect, having a former, deputy mayor of a council where the minister happened to become from, was someone compared with Sir Rod Eddington. Compared with Sir Rod Eddington, was just an undermining of that process, and it was not taken seriously. The legislation that is before the Parliament, moved by the Infrastructure Minister, will make sure that there's transparency, will make sure that there's proper analysis, because there is a finite level of resources, and that is why we should make sure that productivity drives that agenda going forward. That is what my government is committed to, and that is what we will get on with the business of doing. And I look forward to the Parliament supporting the legislation moved by the Minister.
Order. I give the call to the member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. What will the passage of the safeguard mechanism mean for the Australian economy and for Australian businesses?
Give the call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you to the member for Dunkley for her question. Today is a really important day for our environment, but also for our economy. The passage of the safeguard mechanism through this parliament will deliver long overdue policy certainty for our economy. This is what Australian businesses and investors have been crying out for, and it's what the Australian people voted for. The safeguard mechanism will finally put the Australian economy on a credible pathway to net zero. And after a decade of drift, division and dysfunction and 22 failed energy policies of the former government, business has been pleading for certainty, and now they will get the certainty that they need and deserve to invest. The safeguard mechanism will create new jobs in new industries and deliver new investment. Deloitte estimates that the transition to net zero could add an extra $890 billion to our economy over the next 50 years and create an extra 195,000 jobs. Australian businesses and investors see the potential of harnessing all of this demand for renewable energy to broaden and deepen our industrial base, while at the same time maximising our traditional economic strengths. Businesses and investors understand the safeguard mechanism is the best way to provide this investment certainty that they crave and require. As the Prime Minister said, the BCA, the Chamber of Commerce, the Australian Industry Group all want this done. And that's what makes it all the more ridiculous that the so-called party of business is voting against this legislation. And by standing in the way of this legislation—
The Treasurer resume his seat. Order. Members on my right will cease interjecting immediately. The Manager of Opposition on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, it was, to give credit where credit is due, a commendably tight question. What will the passage of the safeguard mechanism mean for Australian economy and Australian businesses? The Treasurer is now well into a generalised attack on the opposition, which is well outside the scope of the question, and he should be directed back to the terms of the question.
I'm just going to ask the Treasurer to return to that part of the question around the economy and business and give him the call.
Mr Speaker, anybody who stands in the way of this investment and this certainty that the business community desperately needs is standing in the way of future investment, future industries and future jobs, and they are on the wrong side of history. And in being on the wrong side of history, the Leader of the Opposition is once again showing that he is more negative than Tony Abbott, more divisive than the member for Cook, and less capable of learning the lessons of the wasted decade and the last few elections than anybody else in this place. The climate is changing, Mr Speaker, but this coalition never will. But the Albanese government and this parliament will get on with the job of providing business the certainty that they need in the interests of our economy, our environment and our country, and that's why today is such an important day.
Give the call. I give the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. The same rules apply to both sides of the chamber. Members are not to be interjected on before they ask their question. Give the call to the member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Increased mortgage payments and rising costs of living means Victorians with a mortgage will pay more than $19,000 extra this year. $19,000 worse off this year. Will this out-of-touch Prime Minister finally admit that Australian families always pay more under Labor?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Tell you something that'll make a difference in living standards. That's getting wages going again.
Order. Members on my left.
And Philip Lowe,
members
the
on my left will
RBA
cease
governor,
interjecting.
might know something about it. He said this on the 8th of March. Wages growth is stronger than it was a few years ago, which is a welcome development. It is also positive that the rate of wages growth remains consistent with the inflation target. Something else that will make a difference for people, wherever they live, even in the state electorate of Wallandilly and other areas as well, is the record number of Australians that are in full-time employment. And I'm very proud that in the first 6 months of this government, more jobs were created than under the first 6 months of any government going back as far as records are kept. The other thing that will make a difference in terms of people's—
Order. The member for McEwen will cease interjecting. I'll hear from the member for Hume.
Mr Speaker, it was a very specific question. It's about Victorians with a mortgage being worse off.
The question, rising cost of living and mortgages, about extra paying this year and about families. I'm going to call the Prime Minister back to order. Well, I can't hear the Prime Minister at the moment because there's far too many people interjecting. So if you want me to make these rulings, I've got to be able to hear what the Prime Minister is saying. And I'll give him the call.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And the other thing that would have made a difference is if the member opposite had have delivered on his election promise to reduce wholesale electricity price to $70 per megawatt hour by the end of 2021, instead of the $286. The $286 that was delivered by this bloke opposite, the worst energy minister that Australia has ever had.
The House will come to order so I can hear from the member for Corangamite.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. How is the Albanese Labor government addressing the current challenges confronting Medicare? What factors have contributed to the current situation?
The call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Corangamite for her question. She knows that our government has no higher priority than strengthening Medicare and delivering cheaper medicines. And, Mr Speaker, she'll be very pleased to know that we're getting on with the job of doing just that. In May, in the Treasurer's second budget, we'll deliver the government's response to the Strengthening Medicare Task Force, which is underpinned by $750 million in new investment in Medicare. This year, we'll deliver 50 urgent care centres that will be providing care in the community 7 days a week from 8 a.m. till 10 p.m. for non-life-threatening emergencies, all free of charge, all fully bulk billed, taking much-needed pressure off our deeply stressed hospital emergency departments. And, Mr Speaker, we've obviously already delivered on our commitment to put in place the biggest cut to the price of medicines in the 75-year history of the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. Good for the hip pocket and good for people's health. And, Mr Speaker, there could be no more important time to strengthen Medicare because, as the member for Corangamite tells me, it's never been harder to see a doctor right now than it is today, and never more expensive. And, Mr Speaker, that didn't happen just by chance. It is a product of 9 long years of cuts and neglect to Medicare by those opposite. And there is no single person in Australia more responsible for the current state of Medicare than the Leader of the Opposition. The contrast between our first budget, Mr Speaker, and the Leader of the Opposition's first foray as Health Minister back in 2014 could not be starker. While we're taking pressure off hospitals with urgent care centres across the country, he tried to cut $50 billion out of hospital funding as well as a range of other hospital programs. While we delivered in January a cut of $12.50 to every general patient script, he tried to jack up the price of every single medicine script in this country, including by $5 a script for general patients. And while we've committed more funds to Medicare in this budget, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition tried to make every single Australian pay for every single visit to the doctor through his infamous GP tax. And when that was blocked by the Senate, rightly so, Mr Speaker, instead he started a 6-year freeze to the Medicare rebate that ripped billions and billions of dollars out of general practice. No wonder, Mr Speaker, that Australia's doctors overwhelmingly voted the Leader of the Opposition the worst health minister in the Medicare era of Australia. He just can't be trusted with Australia's health care.
Give the call to the Honourable the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. A typical Australian family with a mortgage today is paying $1,700 a month more than when the Coalition was in government last year. Power bills are rising sharply and the cost of living is going up and up. Inflation is at its highest level in 30 years. Will this out-of-touch Prime Minister finally admit that families always pay more under Labor?
The member for Newcastle, the member for Lyons, the member for Cooper will cease interjecting. Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I'm asked a very broad question.
The member for Deakin is warned.
About the cost of living and the impact of inflation and housing and energy policy. And indeed, we had legislation last December about energy policy. We had the cap on gas and on coal. Gas here, coal in New South Wales and Queensland, and that made a difference of halving the wholesale price that was predicted at the time of the October budget. And we also had a $1.5 billion
for New England
energy price relief plan that the Deputy Leader of the Opposition voted against. But we voted in favour of it, and that will be included in the May budget. But there is an opportunity for redemption, Mr Speaker. I always believed that people can redeem themselves. I have that faith. The nuns at St Joseph's Camperdown taught me that, Mr Speaker. They did. And there's an opportunity on housing with the Housing Australia Future Fund to actually do something about housing policy. And this is what the HIA, the Housing Industry Association, said. The government's goal to build 30,000 social houses, and believe it's a worthy goal to get behind. More supply means cheaper rents. Now, the Deputy Leader says that that is irrelevant. I actually think it isn't irrelevant at all going forward. Fortunately, some over there.
The Prime Minister will pause. I'll hear from the Deputy Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
On a point of relevance, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister is simply not addressing the question at all in any way, and we have asked this question hundreds of times, and it never gets an answer.
Resume your seat. Order. Members on my right, the Deputy Leader was heard in silence. The Leader of the House will be showing the same courtesy. I give him the floor.
Mr Speaker, the final part of that question, and it's been the final part of a number of questions, goes to particularly asking ministers, or in this case the Prime Minister, to compare and contrast where would you pay more. That tag specifically invites a comparison with the previous government. That's exactly what it's doing, and the Prime Minister is simply responding to exactly that part of the question.
Order. Order. The Prime Minister was talking about housing and quoting the HIA. Order. I'm just going to ask him to make sure that's relevant to the part of the question which was about the cost of housing and the cost of mortgages as well, and I'll give him the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And the Master Builders Association had this to say, the CEO. They called on the Senate not to miss an opportunity for sensible reform in helping to achieve the housing needs for the future. That's what they've had to say. But you don't have to go to the business community. You could just go to a member of the backbench, because this is what the member for Bass had to say. At its core, it is a step forward towards providing more Australians, more Tasmanians, mums and dads, women escaping family and domestic violence, older Australians and younger people with a roof over their head. I can't stand here as an elected representative and make a choice to ignore their needs. There in one paragraph is a member of the opposition's own team calling out the fact that they do ignore their needs, calling out the fact that they just vote no to everything, regardless of whether it will make a practical difference to people's lives. The Housing Australia Future Fund will make a practical difference to people's lives, which is why those opposite should support it.
Give the call to the member for Patterson.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. What pressures are placed on the budget when ongoing programs are left unfunded?
Order. Give the call to the Treasurer.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and thanks to the member for Patterson for her question. 6 weeks tomorrow from this dispatch box, the Albanese government will hand down its second budget, and we have been upfront about the pressures on the budget and the pressures on our economy which provide the context for that budget. And in this environment, there is, as always, a premium on what's responsible and what's affordable, methodical, and what is sustainable in the budget, but also making sure that we continue to clean up the mess that we were left by those opposite. And one of the biggest pressures on the budget in May will actually be programs which any normal human being would assume are ongoing programs, which those opposite only funded in lots of cases until the end of June this year. Now, this is how those opposite booby-trapped the budget that they left behind with all of these ongoing programs which aren't funded in an ongoing way. And so in our first budget in October, we had to spend more than $4 billion to make up for these cover-ups when it came to essential government programs that weren't funded in an ongoing way, unlegislated zombie measures that were never going to pass the parliament, and the failure of those opposite to adequately provision for funding for the COVID response. And, Mr Speaker, once again in May we will need to find billions of dollars to make up for those opposites' propensity to make big announcements but not actually fund them in the budget. Let me give you a few examples, Mr Speaker. For example, the former government jumped up and said they were going to fund 50% of the Olympics in South East Queensland. They budgeted precisely $0 for that task. Those opposite, they had the My Health Record system that's used by millions of Australians to store personal health information, not funded beyond the middle of this year. The E-Safety Commissioner that's responsible for keeping our kids safe online, not funded. The Australian Radioactive Waste Agency in charge of disposing radioactive materials, not funded. MyGov is not funded in an ongoing way. This is the way that those opposite went about vandalising the budget, Mr Speaker. They were notorious for making the big announcements but not funding them in the budget. And the Leader of the Opposition can't distance himself from this behaviour. He was a member of the Expenditure Review Committee that made these decisions. And he sits over there hoping if he doesn't ask any questions, the voters of Aston won't notice and won't remember who the leader of the Liberal Party is in Canberra. They were notorious for doing this, Mr Speaker. Those opposite should take responsibility for the mess that they made of the budget in the same way that we take responsibility for cleaning it up.
Before I call the member for Page, I'd like to acknowledge former Olympians Daniel Kowalski and David McKinnon, who are in the gallery today. A very warm welcome to you both. And I give the call to the member for Page.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government. I refer the Minister to the government's failure last week in Parliament to address the regional programs delay for local councils, and given it has been 10 months since the federal election and 5 months since the budget, how many grants to local councils and community groups have been formally assessed and approved from Labor's regional and community programs announced in the budget?
Call to the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport. No, the Minister will resume his seat. The member for Barker will leave the chamber. I have been crystal clear about that sort of behaviour. No, when members are asking questions, they'll be heard in silence. The time to interject is when the minister is speaking, not when— well, I correct that record. Let's get on with it. I give the call to the Minister for Infrastructure.
Thank you very much. I think, Mr Speaker, can I thank the member very much for his question? We inherited an absolute mess when it came to regional grants. And if you remember, we got elected on a promise to clean up the rorts and pork barrelling that categorised the regional grants program. When we came into government, we had the Building Better Regions Fund, which of course was the subject to a substantial Australian National Audit Office report, which found that there were significant flaws in the way in which the previous government made decisions. When we came to office, we found that not a single one of the Round 6 Building Better Regions Fund had been assessed at all. So concerned were all of you about all of those programs and so concerned that you were asked specifically about it.
Order. I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition.
Mr Speaker, on relevance, a very specific question. How many grants to local councils and community groups have been formally assessed and approved from Labor's regional and community programs announced in the budget? Very, very specific. That is very specific. And if the Minister can't answer the question, she should admit.
Thank you. Resume your seat. There was a little bit more before we got to that part, and I'm sure the Minister is addressing that part of the question, and I'm sure I'll listen carefully for the remaining 2 minutes to make sure she addresses the specific project that you did request.
Thank you again, Mr Speaker. And again, of course, I am talking about the reason that when we came to government, we have had to clean up the appalling job that those opposite, particularly the National Party, did when it came to regional grants program. So I don't make any apologies about us taking some time to actually build integrity into the regional grants program, because we had, under the Community Development Grants program, billions and billions of dollars, frankly pork-barrelled into National Party and Liberal Party seats across this country. So we are taking our time with the Growing Regions program. The guidelines are currently before all of the stakeholders to look at to ensure that we are using the best possible processes that we can. And the announcement about the opening of those applications will be done shortly. But again, I remind the House, the reason we have had to do this and to take our time is because of the terrible job those opposite did when it came to regional grants program. Frankly, when it comes to things like the community development grants, like the Building Better Regions Fund, you have no integrity when it came to the distribution of those grants, and I'm looking forward to having a program that puts in place an important program to fund our regions, properly, fairly and transparently, something those opposite were incapable of doing, and it absolutely shows why not a single one of them should ever occupy these benches ever again when it comes to integrity, when it comes to grants.
The member for Page. Give the call to the member for Jagga Jagga.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to support online safety for Australians, and what challenges does the E-Safety Commissioner face in supporting the government's objectives?
Give the call to the Minister for Communications.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. She knows that the safety of all Australians is a core priority of the Albanese government, including online. It is fundamental that our online world, which is so much a part of our daily lives, provides safe and inclusive environments, maximises the benefits of the digital economy and supports social cohesion. Ensuring the safety of Australians online has been a shared goal across government and civil society, with Labor supporting the passage of the Online Safety Act when we were in opposition. The Albanese government is now undertaking the substantive work to ensure that the Act is successfully implemented, together with our regulator, the E-Safety Commissioner. E-Safety has been undertaking important work in relation to the basic online safety expectations outlined in the Act, recently issuing a second set of reporting notices to 7 digital platforms on the steps they are taking to tackle online child sexual exploitation material. The Commissioner is also requiring industry to review and submit draft codes to address the most serious, harmful online content. E-Safety has also been supporting the government's work to tackle safety on online dating apps. Following our roundtable on this issue in January, the E-Safety Commissioner has been working with agencies across government to inform consultation with victim survivors about their lived experiences of harm facilitated by dating apps. This is really critical work to raise the bar for online safety, to hold the platforms to account for their actions to keep Australians safe. But despite its critical role, members will be astounded to learn that E-Safety has been operating without funding certainty thanks to the decisions by those opposite. The fact is, Mr Speaker, it's been relying on non-ongoing or terminating funding for years. Mr Speaker, can you believe that E-Safety's base funding of $10.3 million has never been increased since it was established in 2015? And this is despite E-Safety being given significantly expanded powers. Wow. In fact, Mr Speaker, after the 30th of June this year, thanks to funding decisions by the now opposition, E-Safety would face a funding cliff, with their overall funding dropping from $53.8 million down to $23.3 million. Mr Speaker, that's more than a 50% decrease. And like every budget announced in the last government, they went for short-term expediency and never addressed the structural underfunding of key agencies like E-Safety. Once again, Labor is left to clean up the mess left by those opposite. In contrast, we will fund the regulator so it can do its important job.
Give the call to the honourable member for Fowler.
Is to the Prime Minister.
the government has committed to spending $368 billion on acquiring nuclear-powered submarines when people are struggling to pay the grocery bills. Yet we still don't know the full cost to taxpayers and where and how the nuclear waste will be stored. What will it cost our taxpayers to manage this nuclear waste, and will Australia be accepting any nuclear waste from other AUKUS countries under the agreement?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for her question. The first question on AUKUS I've got from anyone on the other side. This is a very significant announcement, and we put up over a period of decades the fact that the cost would be between $268 billion and $368 billion. Under that arrangement, Australia will be responsible at the end of life, when the nuclear fuel cell is completed. We will be responsible for the storage of that, and we've said that it will be on defence land. We also, I can confirm that there is no responsibility to store anyone else's waste. It's a responsibility to store what effectively will be our own, because what the plan is here is for us to build these subs in Adelaide, and for, once the Australian flag is on a submarine, like once the Australian flag is on a plane or on any other piece of equipment, it is our responsibility and we are in control. That is a part of our national sovereignty that I hope that the member opposite would agree is important. But the issue on the economy is also important to say this. Unless our national security is looked after, then the impact on our economy, on our society, on everything else falls away. And that is why expenditure and investment in our national sovereignty is so important, is so absolutely vital. And I don't apologise for making a commitment that will see our defence expenditure rise over future years. The truth is we live in an era of strategic competition in our region. The truth is we live in very uncertain times, and it is important that we invest in our capability. It's also important that we invest in our relationships, and my government is doing both. We're investing in our capability, whether it be nuclear-powered submarines or whether it be other military equipment that will improve our capability. Next month we'll be releasing the Defence Strategic Review that will outline the work of Sir Angus Houston and Stephen Smith. But that is an important priority for us going forward. We make no apologies for that. But at the same time, we're also building positive and constructive relationships to advance peace, security and stability in our region.
Give the call to the honourable member for Canberra.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Arts. Why are the national collecting institutions so important to Australia, and what funding situation are they currently in?
Give the call to the Minister for the Arts, the Employment and Workplace Relations.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Canberra for the question, but also being an absolute champion of the national collecting institutions. Because those collecting institutions are there to make sure that the most precious items of the Australian story are kept safe, are kept publicly available and are kept forever. But if you were to look at the budget items for what we were left with, there was also a presumption they'd be kept safe, they'd be kept publicly available and they'd be kept until the 30th of June this year. Because that is when the funding runs out in so many ways for the institution. Additional funding runs out for the Maritime Museum on the 30th of June, for the Portrait Gallery on the 30th of June, for the National Museum on the 30th of June, for the Bundanon Trust on the 30th of June, for the National Film and Sound Archive on the 30th of June, for the National Gallery of Australia on the 30th of June, for the National Library money, the extra money runs out on the 30th of June, and for Old Parliament House, the additional money runs out on the 30th of June. Now, those opposite have already started interjecting about what a wonderful job they did with respect to the arts and cultural institutions.
Order.
So wonderful. There's actually a motion on the notice paper at the moment from the member for Lyons saying that their arts funding reached 55 million Australians. So, with those sorts of numbers, they've got quite a story to tell.
Order.
Part of telling the Australian story isn't just the institutions themselves, but it's about digitising that story and keeping it through the process of Trove. And many members on this side and across the crossbench have contacted me for some time about Trove. Trove is one of the Australian government's most visited online services, more than 50,000 visits a day. Over 1,500 digitised newspaper titles, 900 partner organisations, but under their proposal it would be funded until, guess what date? The 30th of June. And at the 30th of June, the money for the National Library to be able to continue funding Trove was all going to finish. It's across all the collecting institutions. Now, I don't know if they thought, maybe at the National Gallery, they thought, oh, you'll hold the roof up with blue poles, or maybe it'd be like night at the museum, and all the exhibits would start running around and fixing the building themselves every night. But under their funding, the workers don't have a future who work there, and under their funding, the buildings are allowed to leak and collapse. This is the legacy. This is the legacy. And they laugh about the leader of the National Party laughing about the concept of the building leak. Think of the value of what's held in the National Gallery. Think of the concept of being custodians of the national story, and think about a budget where everything finished on the 30th of June.
The member for Hume will cease interjecting, so I can hear from the member for Deakin.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, since the government abolished the cashless debit card, the consequences have been devastating, with police records showing an almost doubling of offences in Ceduna alone. Prime Minister, in the gallery today there are representatives from the Northern Goldfields who are here to speak to parliamentarians about the devastating effects the government's abolition of the cashless debit card is having on their communities. When will the Prime Minister reverse his reckless decision to abolish the cashless debit card?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. The Minister will be meeting with the delegation who are here today, and I understand from a media release from the member opposite that he has raised them meeting here, and of course people should have the opportunity before this parliament to engage. It's something that my government does. We respect people. We listen to people and went to the election with a clear commitment.
The member for Deakin is on a warning, and if he interjects one more time, he will leave the chamber.
That on so many of the issues that have been raised, for example in the Northern Territory, where there hasn't been a change, there is substantial misinformation about the impact which has occurred there. The truth is
members
that
on my left,
in so many of these communities, what we're dealing with is intergenerational disadvantage. That is a failure of all governments, across the board. Now, the minister might like to, or the shadow minister might like to think that everything was all okay beforehand. But the truth is that when you sit down and talk with communities, as I have around the country, they will inform you. They will inform you that these issues of intergenerational disadvantage, intergenerational unemployment, despair is something that has brought certainly myself to the view that we need to try do things better in the future. That's what my government's committed to do. That's what my government's committed to do, and I'd encourage those opposite, and in particular the member opposite, to engage in a constructive way with the government to achieve solutions going forward in their interests.
The member for McEwen will cease interjecting. The member for Fremantle is warned. Give the call to the member for Bean.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Resources. How is the Albanese Labor government ensuring responsible management of the Commonwealth's radioactive waste inventory?
Give the call to the Minister for Resources and the Minister for Northern Australia.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bean for his question. This government is ensuring responsible management of the Commonwealth's radioactive waste inventory by cleaning up the mess left by the Liberals and the Nationals. As we know, radioactive waste is a population and environmental health issue. The vast majority of Australia's radioactive waste is a byproduct of the production of nuclear medicine for the treatment of cancers. It's imperative that government stores and disposes of this material safely to future-proof a vital industry that is of vital importance to health treatments for so many Australians. Those opposite they agreed with this. It was a bipartisan position. They introduced a bill to create an agency to manage this waste, citing its, and I agree, its national importance. But what they failed to do was to fund it. That's right. Those opposite sought to create an agency that would have the care for radioactive waste, which, as we know, lasts thousands of years, yet they let the funding fall off a cliff. There is not a penny in their budgets for ongoing operations for the Australian Radioactive Waste Agency. I want to be clear, we support the AWA, the Australian Radioactive Waste Agency, but it needs funding to continue its work, something that those opposite neglected. Order. Now, I understand the two ministers for resources of the former government had a lot on their plates, and of course they found time to create a massive grants program for where the site is, and some of those, I must admit, are excellent projects. But delivering funding for the ongoing management of our radioactive waste inventory and the design of disposal pathways, which we know takes time, well, absolutely no way. We would not do that. That's what those opposite did. And because of the budget mess left by the Liberals and Nationals, later this year the money for the agency within my department does run out. So I'm asked how we're going to fix it. Well, we're going to find the extra funding that's needed that they decline to do because they are irresponsible with the finances of the budget of this nation. Almost every Australian will benefit from nuclear medicine in their lifetime. Everyone in this place will know someone who has benefited or needed cancer treatment, and they can understand why this material exists and why we need to safely store it, especially after its life-saving medical applications. So why wouldn't you fund it? So why would you stop funding such an important program? I am asked, and they keep heckling me and interjecting about the funding. This is the people who suggest we use nuclear power, the most expensive form of energy known to the world, yet they would not continue funding for the Australian Radioactive Waste Agency. You are hypocrites. It's unbelievable what you say. We support AWA and we will make sure it's funded, unlike those opposite.
Give the call to the member for Brisbane.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Student help debt hangs over entire generations, adding more financial stress to people already struggling through the cost of living crisis. If the government can afford the $254 billion Stage 3 tax cuts and to spend $368 billion on nuclear submarines, why can't we afford to wipe student debt?
Give the call to the Treasurer.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and thanks to the member for his question. We understand that students and young Australians are under pressure at a time when we've got inflation which is higher than we'd like and will hang around for longer than we'd like. Our job is to try and strike the right balance between the most responsible budget possible and doing what we can to ease the pressures on people. We've got a system, as the honourable member knows and all honourable members here know, where people repay their student debt when they reach a certain income level. They pay a portion of their university costs. We think that that is a good system because it means that people don't start to repay that debt until they're beginning to earn what is approaching a decent wage. Obviously, we are aware in the last few weeks there have been stories about the pressures on former students in particular, reports about students and former students under pressure. We take that very seriously. When it comes to the broader pressures on the budget, we've been upfront about those as well, and we need to manage those carefully in the context of high inflation, which is impacting disproportionately, including on the people he asks the question on behalf of. One of the other things, Mr Speaker, which is really important, is to make sure that we are building more social and affordable housing for people. And that's why it is so disappointing, Mr Speaker, that when the Greens in this place were given the opportunity to vote for more social and affordable housing, they scurried for the door. They ran for the door. And that was disappointing, Mr Speaker, because you would have thought for a party that talks so much about younger people, a party that talks so much about affordable housing, the least they could have done is to support the minister's efforts to put in place this $10 billion fund to build more social and affordable homes for people, so that we can get the supply up, so we can build more homes and begin to take some of the pressure off people. And so it was disappointing. On the specifics of the question, I think I've answered that about pressures on students and former students in particular. The least that the Greens could do is when the government puts forward a sensible, important policy to make life a bit easier for those people, the least they could do is vote for it.
Give a call to the member for Tangney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Why it is important to provide continuity of funding for vital health programs?
I give a call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Tangi for his question. I know just how hard he works in his electorate in Perth to deliver better healthcare services. Mr Speaker, earlier in question time today I talked about how hard it's become to see a doctor in Australia today and how expensive it also is. For the first time in the history of Medicare, almost 40 years, the average gap fee for a standard GP consult is now actually more than the Medicare rebate itself. And that didn't happen by chance. It's the product of deliberate decisions taken by the former government over 9 long years, in particular, as I said earlier in question time, by the Leader of the Opposition when he was Health Minister back in 2014. But beyond those obvious cuts, those published cuts and neglect to Medicare, Mr Speaker, there is a long list of cuts to health programs buried in fine print in the Morrison government's final budget. Dozens and dozens of ongoing health programs that the former government refused to fund beyond the 30th of June this year. Now, Mr Speaker, Australians have learned over the last 3 years just how important electronic or digital health is today. And the centrepiece, the mothership piece of Australia's digital health system, allowing electronic prescribing, telehealth and so much more, is My Health Record, the personally controlled electronic health record of 23 million Australians, Mr Speaker. And although, Mr Speaker, I know it is hard to believe, in the Morrison government's last budget, no money at all was put aside to keep the My Health Record system going. Not a single dollar extended to fund the My Health Record beyond the 30th of June.
If he interjects one more time, he will leave the chamber.
Switching off the electronic health records of 23 million Australians in just 14 weeks' time and expecting Australia's doctors, nurses, health professionals to dust off their fax machines because we're putting digital health behind us, apparently. Likewise, Mr Speaker, not a single dollar was put into the budget, the Morrison government budget last year, to fund adult public dental health services.
The Minister will pause, and I'll hear from the member for Page on a point of order.
Thank you, Speaker. Relevance. The ministers opposite continue to refer to previous governments when they're asked questions. It's a habit of theirs, and they defy your rulings.
Appreciate the feedback from the member, but the question was about why it is important to provide the continuity of funding for vital health programs. The minister is being relevant. He's coming to the conclusion of his answer, and I'll remind him to remain relevant at all times to the question, and I'll give him the call.
Yes, thank you, Speaker. I'm talking about ongoing programs usually funded for the full 4 years of a budget's forward estimates. In this case, the Adult Public Dental Scheme, which delivers vital dental services to 180,000 pensioners and low-income Australians every single year. Now, it's not clear to me whether they deliberately intended to cut these services or just wanted to make their last budget look better. Perhaps the Leader of the Opposition, as a member of the Budget Committee, the ERC, can enlighten us which one it was.
Time has concluded. Give the call to the member for Barara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Labor governments have routinely released Solicitor-General advice when convenient to do so on at least 3 occasions. Why won't the government release the Solicitor-General's advice about the voice to Parliament? Why does the government release advice only when it's politically convenient to do so?
The call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. The government doesn't release cabinet papers, nor did the government that he sat in for 9 years release cabinet documents, not once. Not once. Now, I'm asked about, I assume this is talking about the voice to Parliament, although the question didn't refer to that. But the fact is, the fact is that I would encourage the Shadow Attorney General to continue to engage with the government, because one of the things that he knows, because he helped to write some of the words, that are now going to be put before the Australian people when he was a part of a process more than a decade ago. So what the Shadow Attorney General knows, others mightn't, but he knows full well, is how disingenuous some of the comments have been made. Because the Shadow Attorney General, the
Prime Minister will pause. The Prime Minister was talking about the member for Braddon is interjecting in his wrong seat and will cease interjecting or will leave the chamber. The member for Wannon on a point of order.
Just on relevance, Mr Speaker, it was a very direct question on the Solicitor-General's advice. Would you please refer why you won't release the Solicitor-General?
The member, well, whoever it is, can cease. Can I just call the Prime Minister?
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I answered the question very directly with my first answer, which was for the same reason that the former government didn't release documentation that was specifically provided for the cabinet over their 9 years in government. Now, the Shadow Attorney General, has actually been involved in a deeper way in this process for longer than I have been, and that is why he knows full well. He knows full well that some of the campaign that it has attempted to draw questions where they simply are not there, are disingenuous going forward. And Noel Pearson nailed the Shadow Attorney General in his article in The Australian of a few weeks ago. I'd say to the Shadow Attorney General, he was right then. He should have the courage to stand up for the principled position that he has historically taken on this issue and support, yes, when it's put to the Australian people later this year. And now the Leader of the Opposition's broken his vow of silence today through interjecting about something. Now, the Shadow Attorney-General knows, because it was outlined historically, how this process occurred in that article by Noel Pearson just a couple of weeks ago in the Weekend Australian. To the credit of the Weekend Australian, they got it right, and I'd say to the member to reflect on that.
Give a call to the member for Solomon.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. Why is funding certainty so important for essential government functions like biosecurity? And what happens when governments don't plan for the future by providing this certainty?
I'll give a call to the Minister representing the Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry and the Minister for Trade and Tourism.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Solomon for his question. He knows, particularly being from the Northern Territory, just how important our biosecurity system is for agriculture in the Territory. You'd think, frankly, that it would go without saying that funding certainty for essential government functions like biosecurity is vital. You'd think it would go without saying. Certainly, we on this side of the House absolutely understand how vital that is. We understand the need to protect the Australian community from biosecurity threats that could wipe out our agricultural industry. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry that we rely on for our export trade. $5.7 trillion of environmental assets are, of course, incredibly important to this country, and 1.6 million jobs across Australia depend on effective biosecurity measures. Everyone in Australia shares the benefit of a strong biosecurity system, and we all have an incredibly valuable role to play in supporting it. That is why it is so important that our biosecurity system has funding certainty. Unfortunately, what we now know is that the former coalition government, squandering 9 long years, left our biosecurity system without the funding certainty it needed to do its job. And I'm sure that everyone, including every farmer in this country, would be very surprised to learn that embedded in the Liberals' last budget was a drop in funding for biosecurity of 20% on the 30th of June this year, and another 25% drop on the 30th of June next year. That is the legacy of biosecurity that the previous government has left us. The funding falling off a cliff, trying to make sure that in an election year that their budget looked okay, they failed to properly fund biosecurity going forward. And we know that, of course, this previous government refused to do the hard work to actually fund it. As if the people of Northern Australia don't need protecting from foot and mouth disease or lumpy skin disease, as if our prawn farmers don't need protecting from white spot disease, as if our horticultural industry doesn't need protecting from varroa mite, as if Australians aren't going to need detector dogs at our airports to keep out exotic pests and disease. On the National Party's watch, the number of detector dogs at our airports dropped from 80 in 2012 to only 39 in 2019. That is what happened under their watch. So concerned were they about biosecurity. Of course, we have now been left, after an irresponsible and reckless coalition government, we have now been left to clean up your mess.
Give the call to order. Members on my right. The Minister for Resources will cease interjecting. So I can hear from the member for Barara.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. The proposed voice to Parliament will have a constitutional function of making representations to the Executive Government on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Minister, the Reserve Bank of Australia is part of the Executive Government, and interest rates affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as they do all Australians. Will the Reserve Bank need to consult with the Voice before making a decision on interest rates?
Order. No, members on my right will cease interjecting. Order. Members on my right. Before I call the Minister, she'll resume her seat for a moment. The member for Bruce will cease interjecting immediately. I want to hear the question again because order. The member will state his question in silence. Anyone interjects, they'll be leaving the chamber immediately. Give the call to Member Barara.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. The proposed voice to Parliament will have a constitutional function of making representations to the Executive Government on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Minister, the Reserve Bank of Australia is part of the Executive Government, and interest rates affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as they do all Australians. Will the Reserve Bank need to consult with the voice before making a decision on interest rates?
Give the call to the order. The member for Wannon and the Minister for Environment, if they continue to interject, will be warned. The member for Wannon is warned. Well, when I say I'm warning you, if you're going to interject and you keep interjecting, you'll be warned. I think it's pretty straightforward. Give the call to the Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The last time I looked, the Reserve Bank of Australia was independent.
The call to the order. Order. The House will come to order, and I'll give the call to the member for Moreton.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Government Services. What were the findings of the Watt Review about probity and transparency in awarding government contracts?
Give a call to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Minister for Government Services.
A report by Dr Ian Watt AC and a task force were released on Friday. This is a report which was commissioned by the heads of Services Australia and the NDIA on or around the 24th of November last year to investigate matters which had been covered in the media about contracts awarded to in the procurement process to an organisation called Synergy 360. The report found that of the 95 procurements within the scope of the reviews, 19 were flagged for further investigation due to inconsistency with Commonwealth procurement rules. 5 of these were within the NDIA and 14 within Services Australia. The total value of the 19 procurements requiring further investigation is approximately $374 million. Many procurements, according to the reports, lacked appropriate conflict of interest documentation, inaccessible records, and procurements have been poorly managed. There were actual potential or perceived conflicts of interests. However, this morning, in light of the report by Dr Watt, there are disturbing reports in the Age and Sydney Morning Herald concerning decisions to award a government contract to Milo Consulting, also known as Synergy 360. Synergy 360 is partly owned by a Mr David Milo, who is a friend of the member for Fadden. Another part owner of Synergy 360 is a Mr John McGarrison, who is the long-time chairman of the member for Fadden's fundraising body, the Fadden Forum. The reporting notes that a public servant who oversaw this procurement had a close relationship with one of the owners of Synergy 360, and Services Australia cannot identify any record of disclosure. The contract that was the focus of today's reporting ran from the 23rd of May 2019 to the 28th of June. It began at just under $10,000 and it moved up to $30,000. This figure is significant because anything above $10,000 would have needed to have been reported in AusTender. There was another follow-up Milo Consulting contract awarded to the value of $79,585. Again, this is a significant number. Procurements entered into over $80,000 are considered complex and would have needed to go to market. The scope of this work was to advise the Department of Human Services on how to reform its identity verification systems. And at times before and after the Milo Consulting contract within the department, Milo Consulting was informing INSOSYS and UNISYS bidders for Department of Human Services contracts on how to do so. There are emails reported in December following the issuing of the Milo Consulting contracts that there were opportunities to partner with INFOSYS to submit a joint bid response. Again, in October of 2019, emails about the American giant UNISYS that the Milo Consulting had found an opportunity. I wish the Watt Review had come back clean. We've now got 19 contracts that warrant deeper and further investigations. I think it's well past time for the member for Fadden to explain these conflicts and the poor procurement practices on his watch.
Concluded. Give the call to the order. Give the call. Order. Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, it being 3:20, the member for Banks, I say put him in the first 22 questions. The Leader of the Opposition didn't get one. You could have had his.
Order.
Question because of the notice paper.
Just
giving him the opportunity to jump there.
The member for Hawke has indicated he is seeking the call on a personal explanation.